Hey everyone, what's up? Today, we're taking a deep dive into history. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a history lesson like the ones you get from your grandma. We're talking about the Cold War, and we're explaining it all using gaming logic. Imagine it like a massive multiplayer game where the fate of the world is at stake, like Risk, but way more intense. The Cold War was like a huge showdown between two superpowers, the USA and the Soviet Union, like two rival teams, but with nuclear weapons. This went on for decades after World War II. No huge battles, just constant tension, like a penalty shootout, and the threat of total nuclear annihilation. Imagine a game where both teams have enough nukes to destroy the map 100 times over. Crazy, right? Like a cheat code for the apocalypse. That was the vibe during the Cold War. Gloomy and serious. Both sides were flexing their muscles like bodybuilders and trying to outdo each other in every way. Military technology, space exploration, even at the Olympic Games, like competing in sports, but with the risk of nuclear war in the background. It was a constant struggle for global domination, and nobody wanted to hit the surrender button. Like a really serious board game, but with much higher stakes. Let's just say things got pretty wild. Crazier than a wild party. Stay tuned because we're about to explore all the drama, the competition, and the final outcome of this epic global showdown. It's going to be exciting. Okay gamer, time to choose your side. Like picking your favorite sports team, but with way bigger consequences. After World War II, the world was basically split into two teams, like East and West Germany. In the blue corner, we had the United States and their allies rocking the capitalism vibe. Like an economic miracle but global. Think free markets, individual freedom and democracy. Like voting but without all the complicated rules. Basically, they were the cool kids table, or at least they wanted you to think so. In the red corner, we had the Soviet Union and their crew rolling with communism. They were all about government control, equality, supposedly, and a whole lot of propaganda. Everyone the same, and always stuck waiting in line. They had their own ideas about how the world should work, like a different operating system, only not very compatible. Now, choosing a side in the Cold War wasn't as easy as picking Team Edward or Team Jacob. It was more like choosing between two different game modes, story mode or multiplayer. Both sides had their strengths and weaknesses, their own playstyles, and their own ideas about how to win the game. Like two really good sports teams, but with different strategies. The US wanted to spread democracy and capitalism, kind of like a global expansion pack for a video game. The Soviets, on the other hand, wanted to spread communism like a virus in Plague Inc. They wanted to paint the whole map red, like a board game where you try to conquer everything. Okay, let's talk about everyone's favorite thing to do in strategy games, managing the economy. Like Scrooge McDuck, but without the giant money bin. The Cold War was about way more than just nukes and spies, like James Bond in Goldfinger. It was also about which economic system would come out on top, capitalism or communism. Like comparing a BMW to a Trabant. Think of it like choosing your civilization in Civilization, Germans or Romans. The US was like the science-focused civilization, constantly researching new technologies and building a massive industrial base. Like Siemens in the 80s. They wanted to be the economic powerhouse of the world, like the Ruhr Valley. And they were ready to put in the work. Like a train conductor, but with more coal. The Soviets, on the other hand, were more like the military civilization. Like the East German army, but bigger. They poured tons of resources into their military to try and keep up with the US, like learning to drive a tank, but without driver's ed. But their economy just couldn't keep pace, like a Trabant on the Autobahn. Imagine trying to build a Death Star while your workers are on strike. Like building the Berlin-Brandenburg airport, but in space. Not ideal, right? That was the Soviet Union's struggle. Like an East German citizen trying to buy a banana. Their centrally planned economy just wasn't as efficient as the US free market system, like comparing LDI to a department store. Section 4. The Space Race, the ultimate PvE event, like the moon landing but in color. Let's talk about the ultimate PvE event of the Cold War. The Space Race, like an astronaut on the International Space Station but with more excitement. This was the ultimate flex, a race to see who could reach for the stars first and plant their flag on the moon, like reaching the summit of a mountain, but a bit higher. Imagine it like a high-stakes Kerbal space program, but with real rockets and the fate of humanity hanging in the balance. like a rocket launch, but with more pressure. The Soviets took the lead at first, launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit. Like the first car rolling off the assembly line but in space. It was like getting the first kill in a MOBA. The US was shocked, like losing the final game of the World Cup. They had to step up their game, train like an athlete before a big competition. Then came Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. Another Soviet victory, like winning a big singing competition, but more important. But the US wasn't about to give up. Like a race car driver after a pit stop, they poured resources into their space program and trained astronauts like Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin for the ultimate mission, landing on the moon. And in 1969, it happened. Neil Armstrong took one small step for man and one giant leap for the US, securing a massive victory in the space race. Like a major historical event, but in a good way. It was like defeating the final boss in a video game. They finally beat the bad guy. Part 5. Proxy Wars. Side quests with real-world consequences, like playing cards for money, only with human lives. The Cold War wasn't just a two-player game, it was more like a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, MMORPG, with clans and guilds. It was more like a giant online role-playing game, with proxy wars breaking out all over the world. Like World of Warcraft raids, only with real tanks. These were basically side quests where the US and the Soviet Union supported different sides in conflicts, turning local fights into international battlefields. Like playing shooting games at an arcade, only with live ammunition. Imagine two guilds fighting for control of a dungeon. Like two rival soccer teams playing against each other, only with more destruction. They wouldn't fight each other directly, but they would have their players fight on their behalf. Like a game of chess, only with real soldiers. This happened in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and a bunch of other places. Like playing Risk, only with real consequences. These proxy wars were brutal and devastating. Like going on a rampage in Grand Theft Auto, only for real. Millions of people died and entire countries were left in ruins. Like after an earthquake in SimCity, only worse. It just goes to show that even in a Cold War, things can get very real, very quickly. Like driving a car without a license, only with global consequences. Section 6. Cracks in the Iron Curtain. The USSR starts lagging, like dial-up internet in the countryside. In the 1980s, the first serious cracks started to show in the Soviet Union. Their economy was weakening, their technology was falling behind, like a Commodore 64 against a brand new PC, and their people were becoming more and more disillusioned with the communist system. Like a sports fan after their team loses a big game. It was as if their internet connection was slowly dying, like dial-up internet in the 90s. Imagine playing a game with constant lag, glitches and crashes. Like a buggy video game at launch. That's what life in the Soviet Union was like. Grey like a rainy November day. People were fed up with censorship, shortages like toilet paper during a pandemic, and the lack of freedom, like being constantly watched by the government. Meanwhile, the US was flourishing under President Ronald Reagan, like a booming economy. He was like a charismatic raid leader, like a powerful world leader at the height of their power, rallying the free world against the Soviet threat, like a legendary king and his knights. Reagan's policies, combined with the Soviet Union's internal problems like a virus in a computer system, put immense pressure on the communist regime, like the secret police on dissidents. It was only a matter of time before the whole system would collapse. Like a tower of blocks after the wrong move.